Hello, and welcome all to Movie Hunter, the show that tracks down the quality of all sorts of movies. My name is Hunter, and today in the 50th episode, our target is Captain America the First Avenger, produced by Marvel Studios and distributed by Paramount Pictures. In April of 1997, Marvel Studios was in talks of making a Captain America film with Mark Gordon and Gary Levinson to produce, and with Larry Wilson and Leslie Bohem set to write a script. In May of 2000, Marvel teamed with Artisan Entertainment to help finance the film, but a lawsuit against Joe Simon over the copyright of Captain America disrupted the development process. The lawsuit was eventually settled in September of 2003, and Marvel Studios was preparing to license the film rights to Warner Brothers, but producer David Mizell suggested that the company produce it themselves. With the working title The First Avenger Captain America, Marvel announced the film on May 5, 2008. Louis Leterrier, the director of The Incredible Hulk, offered his services, but Marvel turned him down, and in November of 2008, Joe Johnston finally signed on the project. Producer Kevin Feige talked about Johnston's directorial work on 1991's The Rocketeer and 1999's October Sky, as well as his works on the special effects of the original Star Wars trilogy, in reference to why Johnston would make a good fit. The film was going to release on May 6, 2011, but was pushed back to July 22, 2011. It made $370.6 million on a budget of $140 to $216.7 million. It was directed by Joe Johnston, and the screenplay was by Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely. It was based on the character Captain America by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. The producer was Kevin Feige, and the music was by Alan Silvestri. The cinematographer was Shelley Johnson, and the editors were Jeffrey Ford and Robert Dalva. The cast includes Chris Evans, Sebastian Stan, Haley Atwell, Dominic Cooper, Hugo Weaving, Toby Jones, Tommy Lee Jones, Neil McDoug, Derek Luke, Steely Tukey, Kenneth Coy, Bruno Ricci, J.J. Field, and of course Stan Lee. The film was nominated for 26 awards as listed by Wikipedia, of which it won 3 of. The film saw 2 direct sequels in 2014 and 2016. The film follows Steve Rogers trying to be recruited in the Army, but being rejected, with his asthma alone being enough, let alone his small structure. Having attempted to enlist multiple times, each with false information, he tells his friend Bucky that he wants to fight for his country, which one Dr. Abraham Erskine overhears, who enlists him in the super soldier experiment. Colonel Chester Phillips is unconvinced that Steve is the right person to choose, but Dr. Erskine continues to plead his case, given Steve's spirit and good nature. The night before Steve is to undergo procedure, Erskine reveals to him that he was a scientist who worked for SMID, who is the head of Hydra, the Nazi science division. During his time there, SMID took a prototype of the super soldier serum that gave him superhuman strength, but disfigured his face, because the serum amplifies what's already there, in this case his hate. Meanwhile, SMID and Dr. Armin Zola experiment with the Tesseract, planning to betray the Nazis and have Hydra take over the world for themselves. Stephen is injected with the serum and emerges with enhanced abilities, but an assassin kills Dr. Erskine and steals the last vial of the serum, with Steve chasing him down. However, the assassin kills himself to avoid interrogation, and the last vial is destroyed. With Steve being all that remains of the super soldier serum, he is given the name Captain America, and is forced to tour the country selling war bonds, while scientists attempt to reverse engineer the serum. When Steve learns that his best friend Bucky's unit has been captured, with Bucky himself likely being dead, he goes on a secret rescue mission with the help from Agent Peggy Carter and an inventor and pilot Howard Stark. Steve finds the unit, including Bucky himself, and manages to get them all home safely. It's also worth noting that during the mission, Steve and Bucky saw Smid, who revealed to them his face that gave him the name Red Skull. Back home, Howard Stark gives Steve a suit and a shield made from a nearly indestructible metal known as vibranium. Now with a unit that respects him, Steve, Bucky, and the other freed soldiers go on missions sabotaging Hydra's plans. All the while, Steve and Agent Peggy Carter fall in love. On a mission to extract Dr. Armin Zola, who is taking a train across snowy mountains, Bucky falls off the train to his death, causing much grief to Steve. With information gotten from Zola, the final Hydra stronghold is located, with Steve and his team storming it to prevent Red Skull from causing mass destruction to America. When Red Skull takes off in his super bomber plane, Steve jumps on, ensuing in a final fight, ending with Red Skull grabbing the Tesseract and being sucked into a portal, with the Tesseract burning through the plane and into the ocean. Left with no other choice, Steve crashes the plane into the ocean to prevent the weapons from going off. Howard Stark searches the ocean but only finds the Tesseract. The film ends with Steve waking up in the present day, nearly 70 years later, being confronted by Nick Fury. Let's start by talking about Captain America, or more specifically, Steve Rogers. While my favorite superhero is definitely Spider-Man, Captain America is actually quite high up there for me, and this movie actually paints a really good picture of why. Now I'm going to be completely honest and admit that I've never so much as picked up a Captain America comic book, but I think that the portrayal of the character is really well done. I really like Steve Rogers' attitude towards things and how he wants to do the right thing, even if it's more than he's physically able to. It is of little significance to the overall plot, but I also really like how he breaks the rules by submitting applications to the army with false information in the hopes that he'll get the chance to support the cause. This shows that he's willing to do something that's wrong if it supports the greater good, which is a character trait that would become more important in future movies, and begins here. This all builds up to a character who seems flawless, which is usually a trait you don't want the main character to have because it can result in no issue to be solved. So here's where the problem arises. No one will give him a chance. It's not until Dr. Erskine overhears the conversation he has with Bucky that Steve is given a chance to prove himself. And prove himself he does, because he shows what life as the weaker man has taught him. He thinks of things in other ways than just brute force, as demonstrated when everyone attempts to climb the flagpole to get the flag, but he simply takes out the bottom and the flagpole just falls over. He also shows that his heart is pure, right down to the core, when he jumps on what he thinks is an active grenade to save the people around him. People, mind you, who haven't been very kind to him mostly. Another neat detail is the super soldier serum being said to amplify what's already there, contrasting nicely with Smid, who became the Red Skull due to his hatred, unlike Steve, who became very strong and didn't suffer any side effects. Steve's troubles don't end there, though, unfortunately, as Dr. Erskine's death leaves Steve as the only way to replicate the super soldier serum, and thus they must keep him safe. A quick note on Erskine's death. I don't feel like it's done super well. It feels much more like a means to an end, with his death sparking the second act of the film, and it feels very much like Yinsen from the first Iron Man film. But unlike Yinsen, Erskine's death doesn't seem very emotional or impactful to Steve Rogers' story, unfortunately. Either way, Steve essentially becomes the mascot for the war effort, traveling the country to promote war bonds. This is something he's happy to do for the most part, as he is still helping out, but mocking from other soldiers who are actually risking their lives shows that he isn't helping how he wanted to, and now how he is capable of. When his friend Bucky's unit is captured, it gives him just the motivation he needs to sneak out on a field mission, proving to everyone yet again who he is. We then get to the final act where he takes on the Red Skull, ending with his self-sacrifice as he dives the plane into the ocean to prevent any deaths outside of his own, showing that after everything that happened over the course of the movie, he is still the same person he was in the beginning. After all that time, he was still willing to jump onto the grenade for the world. It ends with him still being alive, being melted from the ice nearly 70 years later. I like this a lot, with it being able to get him into future movies while also not taking away from his sacrifice, as he, in many ways, will have to start life over again. I really like Steve Rogers' story. It does peak in the first act, for me anyways, but it is consistently good and makes for a great character to follow. Easily my favorite part of the film. Next, let's talk about the various characters that make up the side cast, such as Peggy Carter, Howard Stark, and Bucky Barnes. The side cast is actually pretty great on average. Let's start with the weakest one, who is unfortunately Steve's best friend, Bucky Barnes. Now, in a way, this is actually a compliment, because there is actually very little wrong with Bucky. He is a perfectly fine character. The main issue I have is that his friendship with Steve really isn't all that well developed. It's kind of a we told you they're best friends, so you're just going to have to believe us type deal. This kind of stinks because it makes Bucky's death a lot less impactful. Not to say that it lacks any impact at all, but that, and the fact that Steve only grieves his death for a scene or two, really lessens what could have been a pretty great scene. Luckily, this won't be the last we see of Bucky, it's just gonna take a bit before we see him again. Next up, we have Peggy Carter, who is in a similar situation, though much improved. I do like her character, and apart from a very random and short misunderstanding between her and Steve, she is pretty consistently of quality in the film. I've made it clear in the past that romance stories really aren't my thing, but if it's any constellation, Steve and Peggy make for the best attempt at romance yet in the MCU, even if I really couldn't think of anything to make special note of. The best that I can say is that she and Steve have quite a few good scenes together, in a naturally paced relationship that doesn't suddenly switch to being really romance heavy, and the send-off between her and Steve as he crashes the plane is really sweet. Howard Stark is a really fun inclusion. I'm not sure if it originated from the comic or not, but either way, he was a really fun inclusion, and not just from the perspective of, oh cool, it's the father of the main character of another movie. He's just a pretty entertaining character, largely due to the performance. A character who I found to be quite underrated was Tommy Lee Jones' character, Colonel Chester Phillips. He starts out as a seemingly unimportant character, with him mostly serving as yet another person who doubts Steve. He is extremely hesitant to have Steve be the one to get the super soldier serum, and if it were up to him, Steve wouldn't be. However, by the end of the movie, he realizes that Steve was the right person for the job, even helping him out in the final battle when he drives him up to the Red Skull's plane. Then we have the Howling Commandos, who are the unit led by Captain America. Unfortunately, much like Bucky Barnes, the team is underutilized, with the team name not even being mentioned in the film. This is really unfortunate because while certain action scenes look really cool with them, their personalities really could have been explored further, because there's a lot of fun variety between the members, and what little glimpses of it we get are really good. Overall, pretty good sidecast. Not everything is perfect. Bucky especially should have been better used given his significance in later films, but overall this is an enjoyable part of the movie. Finally, I want to discuss the villain of the film, Smid, better known as the Red Skull. Firstly, while we're on the topic, why did they call him Smid so much when the name Red Skull is right there? Smaller things aside, I'd argue that the Red Skull is certainly underwhelming considering his status as one of Cap's most formidable foes, and when comparing him to the rest of the film. I think that what he ultimately lacks is presence. In the words of Megamind, the thing that makes a villain a super one is presentation. Red Skull lacks this. I think an interesting yet accurate comparison to make would be Hopper from Pixar's A Bug's Life. Now, Hopper is a villain who I previously complimented for being very intimidating despite being a grasshopper. He holds presence and threat. One compliment I had was in a scene when he killed off 3 of his own men to demonstrate a point to the others. This was not only brutal, and not even just for its reputation as a kid's film, but also showed exactly what was in Hopper's mind, as I talked about in my review. Red Skull has a similar scene in which he kills 3 allies who belong to the Nazis, who he intends to betray and have Hydra take over the world. Now, this scene isn't terrible, The deaths are actually quite cool, really showing off the power of the Tesseract, which was a cool thing to bring back from the Thor movie, by the way. However, it doesn't do much for Red Skull outside of showing us his ultimate plan. I'll admit he has a couple of cool scenes with Captain America, but ultimately lacks a real rivalry with him. He also has the classic MCU problem of being killed off in his debut film. Nowadays, we actually know that he wasn't really killed, but for all intents and purposes, he was killed. This is a shame because he's supposed to be one of Cap's biggest foes, but instead barely speaks to him and then never again. Now, obviously, Cap gets sent to the present day by the end of the film, so how would Red Skull even appear again is a good point to mention, but it's still a shame to see the door shut completely on that. Armin Zola has a similar problem, where I really wish he had a better back and forth dialogue with Red Skull. At the end of the day, Red Skull's a serviceable villain, and played completely seriously too, which is nice, but absolutely could have been better in my opinion. I didn't even get into the fact that he took the super soldier serum, because honestly, I completely forgot. And even so, it has essentially zero importance in the plot, except for explaining why he's called Red Skull, and to give him an interesting contrast to Steve Rogers. I give Captain America the First Avenger a 9 out of 10 for being the best film in Phase 1 of the MCU in my opinion. It's definitely a low 9 out of 10, fitting more into the category of being of quality rather than my favorite, if that makes any sense. It's still a really good film, though. Similar to the Thor movie, the atmosphere is really well done and plays a key role in the film's identity. It kind of makes me sad that that's a skill that the MCU seemed to stop caring about as time went on. Anyways, a good film. Not without its flaws, of course, but still really good. I especially like the main philosophy with Steve Rogers, and his general attitude is captured pretty well throughout the film. Welp, that's all, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and feel free to share any opinions you had on the movie. A new episode releases each week, so stay tuned to see which film I cover next. And in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.